Hey classes, we're moving into chapter 7, so the information in here ties within section 7.1 of the book if you want to go back and review any of the information on your own time. Our topic for today is going to be looking at chromosomes and phenotype. So this is an extension off what we just finished looking at with chapter 6, as we did speak a lot about chromosomes and a lot about phenotype. So let's go and review some of those terms. Some of the terms that we're going to be including in our discussion today are chromosomes, genes, alleles, traits, dominant and recessive forms of alleles, homozygous and heterozygous, genotype, and phenotype. So looking at this image here, we can recap on chromosomes and some genes. We know that chromosomes contain DNA, and within that DNA, which if we uncoil a little section right here, we can see that sections of DNA contain genes. So in this case, we have a section of DNA that contain 2 genes, and on our chromosomes, those are denoted by these bands. So it looks like this chromatid right here would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 genes. Next are alleles. So let's look at 2 chromosomes right here. These would be homologous chromosomes. This one maybe came from the mother and this one came from the father. So these chromosomes would have a gene in the exact same location for the exact same trait. In this case, it's looking like it's flower color. Recall that alleles are different forms of a trait. So the trait is flower color. This gene right here codes for purple flowers, so the allele would be purple. And down here, this gene codes for white flowers, so the allele would be white. Next, we know that how these alleles combine and mess around with one another determines a trait, something that we can see, which is also called a phenotype. And looking at this gentleman over to the right here, he has a trait called a unibrow right there. How does that unibrow result? Well, either it has to do with the combination of alleles that he has. I don't know if this is a dominant or recessive trait. I would assume recessive. So he probably has an allele right here and an allele right here for unibrow and unibrow. Moving right down the line here, we're going to be talking about homozygous and heterozygous. And we can do that right here with homozygous and heterozygous. We can see that these 2 alleles, big A, and these 2 alleles, little a, are the same. So those are the same, big and big, those are the same. That's homozygous combinations of alleles. If they're different, like this one here, big A, little a, that would be heterozygous, or 2 different alleles. And we can see in this example right here that apparently red is dominant over white because we have an allele right here, big A for red, we have a little a for white, and when they're combined, the white is not present at all. So it is definitely a recessive trait right here and dominant right here. Now that we've reviewed some of these terms, I'd like you to pause this on your players right now, and on your sheet that goes with this discussion, I'd like you to come up with a definition for each of these words. When you have completed that part, click play and you can resume with the discussion. So the first section in 7.1, the main idea is that 2 copies of each autosomal gene affect the phenotype. So I want to go back and revisit the karyotype we looked at in chapter 6, and we lay out all of the chromosomes in our cells side by side in pairs from longest to shortest. These pairs of chromosomes are homologous. That means that if this one right here we got from mom, there's a matching one right here that we got from dad. That is true for all of these except for the last pair of chromosomes, which would be our sex chromosomes. In this case, we're looking at a male because we have an X chromosome and an itty bitty Y chromosome. So that's how we know that this is male. So autosomes are pairs 1 through 22. They are chromosomes that determine traits that have nothing to do with whether or not you're male or female. So eye color, for example, hair color, height. That really has nothing to do with your gender. So that's the type of traits that these chromosomes dictate. These two chromosomes right here, the sex chromosomes, in this case XY, if it were female, it would be 2 copies of this X chromosome and no Y chromosome. These chromosomes, as you recall, they determine things that are specific to males or females, depending on which pairs of sex chromosomes you happen to have. Moving along with the same main idea, 2 copies of each autosomal gene affect phenotype. We spoke a lot about in Chapter 6 of dominant alleles versus recessive alleles. However, you think about how many different forms of traits there are for just eye color alone, you should start to realize that there's not just 2 colors, 2 eyes. There's brown eyes, there's green eyes, there's hazel eyes, there's gray eyes, there's blue eyes, and there's a few others as well. That's not just a trait that works on dominant or recessive alleles. So other things that might affect those traits, like eye color. Well, first off, number 1 here, the gene that determines a trait. Is it on an autosome or is it on the sex chromosome? The second thing, is there more than one gene that controls the phenotype? Now, in the case of eye color, I can tell you right now there's at least a few genes that determine eye color. Skin color is another one. There's 3 different genes that all play into the color of your skin. So it's 6 alleles, not just 2. And third, does a dominant allele actually exist? In some cases, there's many dominant alleles, and those dominant alleles have to play nice and come upon a compromise, as we'll look at in 7.2. Moving along, still under the same main idea, 2 copies of each autosomal gene affect phenotype, we're going to be looking at disorders caused by recessive alleles. So, some genetic disorders are caused by recessive alleles on autosomes. What does this mean? Well, this means that 2 copies of the recessive allele must be present for a person to have the disorder. In other words, a person has to be homozygous recessive. So what happens if you're homozygous dominant, which would be like big T, big T? Well, if you're homozygous dominant, you do not have the disorder. What about the heterozygous individuals, like big T, little t? Individuals who are heterozygous, they don't have the disorder either. They have the dominant allele. However, they are carriers, and that's kind of a big deal. So what's a carrier? A carrier is a person who does not show any disease symptoms, but they can pass the recessive allele on to an offspring, or a child, and then that child could get the disease themselves. We're going to take a look at an example of a recessive disorder on our next slide. The example happens to be cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a severe disease. It affects your mucus glands and your sweat glands. And in our scenario right here of this cross, both parents are fine. They do not have cystic fibrosis, but they are heterozygous. That means that they're carriers. So they are both big and little c, big and little c. Now we have to separate those alleles once again, because this parent can either donate the big C or the little c to its child. Same with this guy, can donate the big C or the little c. And when we recombine our alleles in our Punnett square, drop the big C down, bring the big C across, bring the little c across, and this little c down, that's how we get all these in. We can see that this guy, he's fine, he's homozygous dominant. These 2 guys are fine, they're heterozygous, so they do not have cystic fibrosis, but they would be carriers. And then we see this guy right here, little c, is homozygous recessive. So these 2 parents could have a homozygous recessive child. What are the odds of having a child that is homozygous recessive? Right here. One box is little c out of the 4 boxes, so that would be 1 in 4, or 25%. What are the odds of having a child that is heterozygous? Heterozygous, opposite alleles. I see 2 boxes out of the 4, so 2 out of 4, or 50%. And what are the odds of having a child that is homozygous dominant? I see big C, that is 1 out of the 4 boxes, so 1 out of 4 is 25%. Next question, a little bit of review. What is the genotypic ratio? Recall that genotypes are the combination of alleles we happen to have. And when we write out our genotypic ratio, we put the dominant first, the heterozygous second, and the homozygous recessive third. So, how many big C do we have? 1. Heterozygous, 2. Homozygous recessive, 1. So it would be a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. How about the phenotypic ratio, or the ratio that compares the traits? Well, normal, normal, normal. So there's 3 normals and 1 affected. So the phenotypic ratio would be 3 to 1. And the last part of this main idea, 2 copies of each autosomal gene affect phenotype. We're going to be looking at disorders caused by dominant alleles, which are far less common than recessive disorders. Recessive disorders are not all that uncommon, but the dominant ones are. Alright, let's look at this. Dominant alleles. If you are homozygous dominant or heterozygous, you have a dominant allele. Therefore, if you're homozygous dominant or heterozygous, you have the disorder. Interesting though, most disorders caused by dominant alleles result in death within the first few years of life. So if you have a disorder that is dominant, you're going to be dead by the time you're 3 or 4 years old. So why are these alleles rare in the population? There's not many of them around. We know that right here. They're far less common. Why are they not in the population? Well, for these dominant alleles to remain in the population, that means that an individual has to survive beyond the age of 3 or 4. Then they have to have children and pass that dominant allele on to their children. The odds of making it past age 3 or 4 is not all too common, which means that the recessive, the dominant allele disorders are far less common in our population. One example that's kind of contrary to that is Huntington's disease. And people who have this disease, which is a dominant disease, don't actually show any signs or symptoms that they have this disease until they're my age. They're in their mid to late 30s, at which point they start showing that they have Huntington's disease, and they die very shortly after that. So with this in mind, you're in your 30s here, you have no idea you have Huntington's. You'll probably have a few children by that point. So Huntington's is one that does remain in our population. We will be wrapping up the remaining part of this section in the next video. Make sure you have all of your notes filled in from this one, and then we'll be moving into the last 3 or 4 slides on the second part to this section.